For 6 years, Lady Lydia Ashford stood at the periphery of London's most glittering theatre balls, her pale blue gown a ghost among jewels. Society whispered she was cursed, abandoned by Viscount Blackwell at the altar, her name reduced to cautionary tale. She attended every theatrical gala alone, invisible in a sea of dancing couples, until one November evening when the Duke of Greymore leaned close, his voice cutting through years of silence. "Join me, Lady Lydia. It's time you stopped punishing yourself for another man's cowardice." If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford House in Mayfair, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had witnessed 3 generations of quiet desperation. Lady Lydia Ashford sat at her writing desk, her slender fingers tracing the edge of an ivory invitation card embossed with gold lettering. Another theatre ball, another evening of standing alone while London's elite waltzed past her as though she were a piece of broken furniture too pitiful to remove, but too damaged to use. She was 28 now, which in the eyes of Regency society might as well have been 60. Her chestnut hair, once arranged in the latest fashions, was now pulled back in a simple chignon that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her green eyes, the colour of English moss after rain, had lost none of their intelligence, but they had acquired a wariness that made people look away. She was beautiful still, with the kind of delicate features that belonged in a Romney portrait. But beauty without social standing was merely decoration for a room no one entered. 6 years. It had been 6 years since Viscount Edmund Blackwell had stood before the altar at St. George's, Hanover Square, looked into her eyes, and walked away. Not quietly, not with any pretense of illness or sudden revelation. He had simply turned, his face pale but resolute, and walked down the aisle toward the doors, leaving Lydia standing in her grandmother's lace veil, alone before 300 witnesses. The scandal had been immediate and absolute. Within hours, the drawing rooms of Mayfair were alive with speculation. Had she been indiscreet? Was there another woman? Had the Ashford family hidden some terrible secret about their finances or lineage? None of it was true, but the truth had never been particularly relevant to London gossip. The reality was simpler and more painful. Edmund had loved another, Miss Beatrice Hartwell, Lydia's own younger cousin, a girl with golden ringlets and a laugh like crystal bells. He had courted Lydia because her dowry was larger, because her family connections were more prestigious, because marrying the eldest Ashford daughter was the logical choice for an ambitious viscount. But on that morning, standing at the threshold of a loveless life, he had chosen honesty over duty. Lydia might have forgiven him the rejection. What she could not forgive was the method. He could have spoken to her privately, broken the engagement with some manufactured excuse that would have preserved her dignity. Instead, he had humiliated her before everyone who mattered in their world, turning her into a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a punchline. Still brooding over that invitation, I see. Lydia looked up to find her brother Thomas leaning against the doorframe of her study. He was 2 years her junior, a charming wastrel who spent most of his time at his club and the rest avoiding their mother's matchmaking schemes. His dark hair was dishevelled, his cravat loosely tied, the very picture of aristocratic negligence. "I'm not brooding," Lydia replied, setting down the card. "I'm considering whether to attend another ball where you'll stand by the pillars like a statue while everyone pretends not to see you." Thomas crossed the room and poured himself a brandy from the decanter on the sideboard, despite the early hour. "Forgive me, sister, but your social calendar has become rather predictable. What would you have me do, Thomas? Hide in this house forever? Confirm every terrible thing they say about me, that I'm broken, that I'm bitter, that I'm too ashamed to show my face?" "I would have you live," he said quietly, all traces of mockery gone from his voice. I would have you leave London, travel to Bath or Brighton, somewhere you could start fresh without every eye cataloguing your failures." Lydia stood, moving to the window that overlooked the square. The trees were bare, their branches like black lace against the grey November sky. "Running away solves nothing. I am still Lady Lydia Ashford, and I will not let Edmund Blackwell dictate the boundaries of my existence." "So you attend these balls and let him dictate your misery instead." She turned to face her brother, her chin lifting with the pride that had sustained her through 6 years of whispers and pitying glances. "I attend because I refuse to be erased. Every time I walk into those rooms, I remind them that I survived, that I am still here." Thomas sighed, recognizing the futility of argument when his sister had set her mind. "Then at least allow me to escort you. It's torture watching you stand alone." "You have your own life, Thomas. I won't have you sacrifice your social standing on my account." "My social standing is that of a charming rogue who drinks too much and gambles more. One more scandal would hardly register." He smiled, but there was genuine concern in his hazel eyes. "Besides, someone should be there to glare at anyone who dares to snicker." Before Lydia could respond, their mother swept into the room, a whirlwind of lavender silk and strategic intentions. Lady Margaret Ashford was a handsome woman in her 50s, with the same chestnut hair as her daughter, now threaded with distinguished silver. She had spent the 6 years since Lydia's humiliation attempting to repair the damage through sheer force of will and tactical social maneuvering. "Lydia, dear, you must wear the emerald silk to the Pemberton ball. It brings out your eyes, and Lord Pemberton mentioned just last week that his cousin Mr. Aldridge recently returned from India and is seeking a sensible wife." "Mother, Mr. Aldridge is 63 and has buried 2 wives already," Lydia said wearily. "I'm hardly suitable material for a 3rd tragic experiment. Beggars cannot be choosers, my dear. Your situation requires pragmatism, not romance." "I'm not begging for anything," Lydia said, her voice sharp enough to make her mother pause. "I'm attending the theatre ball because I enjoy the performances and because I have every right to be there. My marital prospects are not up for discussion." Lady Margaret's lips thinned, but she was wise enough to retreat. "Very well. But do consider the emerald silk. There's no reason to look defeated, even if one's circumstances are challenging." After her mother departed, Lydia sank back into her chair, exhaustion settling over her like a familiar cloak. Thomas watched her with the kind of helpless sympathy that made her want to scream. "I'm fine," she said, before he could offer more useless comfort. "No, you're not, but you're stubborn enough to convince yourself otherwise." He set down his glass and moved toward the door. "I'll call for you at 8. And Lydia, wear the emerald silk. Mother's wrong about everything except that." The Pemberton Theatre Ball was held at the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane, a magnificent establishment where London's elite gathered to see and be seen. The building glowed with candlelight, its grand entrance flanked by footmen in crimson livery. Carriages lined the street, disgorging beautifully dressed ladies and elegant gentlemen who swept inside as though entering a sacred temple of culture and status. Lydia arrived with Thomas, her emerald silk gown whispering against the marble floors as they climbed the grand staircase. The gown was beautiful, she could admit that much. It hugged her slender figure before flowing into graceful folds, the color indeed bringing out the green of her eyes. Her mother had sent her lady's maid with strict instructions, and Lydia's hair was arranged in an elegant style, with small emerald pins catching the light. Not that it mattered. Beautiful gowns couldn't erase 6 years of social death. They entered the ballroom, a glittering space of gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers. The orchestra played a lively country dance, and the floor was alive with movement. Lydia's eyes automatically scanned the room, cataloguing the familiar faces, the predictable hierarchies, the invisible lines that separated the acceptable from the scandalous. "There's Edmund," Thomas murmured, his hand tightening on her arm. Lydia followed his gaze to where Viscount Blackwell stood near the refreshment tables, his arm around a petite blonde woman with childlike features. Beatrice. They had married 6 months after the scandal, a swift wedding that confirmed every suspicion. They looked happy, or at least content in the way that people who've chosen passion over propriety often do. "I'm fine," Lydia said again, though her chest tightened with the old familiar ache. "You keep saying that. I'm beginning to think you're trying to convince yourself." They found their customary position near one of the marble pillars at the edge of the ballroom. From here, Lydia could observe without being observed, watch the dancers without being expected to participate. Thomas fetched her a glass of champagne and did his best to appear nonchalant, but she could feel his protective energy, the way he positioned himself slightly in front of her, as though shielding her from attack. The evening proceeded as all such evenings did. Old acquaintances nodded politely, but didn't approach. Younger debutantes whispered behind their fans, their mothers steering them away as though bad fortune were contagious. A few brave souls offered stilted conversation before making excuses and drifting back to safer social circles. Lydia endured it all with practiced grace, her smile fixed, her posture perfect. This was her performance, her own theatrical production. She played the role of the dignified spinster, the woman above it all, the lady who has moved on. That the role was exhausting beyond measure was something she kept carefully hidden. Lady Lydia Ashford, a warm, cultured voice said beside her, "I've been hoping to encounter you this evening." Lydia turned to find herself face to face with a woman she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Lady Cordelia Blackwood, her father's eldest sister, had left London shortly after Lydia's father's death to establish a literary salon in Edinburgh. She was a formidable woman in her early 60s, dressed in deep purple silk, her silver hair arranged in an elegant crown of braids. Her eyes, the same green as Lydia's own, sparkled with intelligence and mischief. "Aunt Cordelia," Lydia breathed, genuinely surprised. "I didn't know you'd returned to London." "Only recently, my dear. I've taken a house in Bloomsbury, dreadful neighbourhood by Mayfair standards, but absolutely teeming with interesting people." She smiled, studying Lydia with an intensity that made her niece want to squirm. "You've grown even more beautiful, though I could wish you looked less like a martyr awaiting her execution." Thomas laughed, earning a sharp look from his sister. "Aunt Cordelia, you always did have a gift for brutal honesty. Someone must, since the rest of you tiptoe around truth like it's a sleeping tiger." She linked her arm through Lydia's with the kind of casual authority that brooked no argument. "Thomas, dear boy, make yourself scarce. I'm stealing your sister." Before Lydia could protest, she found herself being swept across the ballroom, away from the pillar, away from the safety of shadows. Aunt Cordelia moved with purpose, nodding to acquaintances, but not stopping until they reached a quieter gallery overlooking the main floor. "Now then," Cordelia said, turning to face her niece, "how much longer do you intend to punish yourself for Edmund Blackwell's weakness?" Lydia blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "I'm not... Please. I may have been in Scotland, but I'm not deaf. You attend every major social event and then stand in the corner like a ghost at your own funeral. You wear beautiful gowns and arrange your face into pleasant expressions and slowly die inside while everyone watches." Cordelia's voice was kind but unyielding. "It's been 6 years, Lydia. Edmund moved on. Perhaps it's time you did the same." "I have moved on," Lydia insisted, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Have you? Or have you simply traded one prison for another?" Cordelia gestured toward the ballroom below. "You think you're being brave, showing your face, refusing to hide. But bravery isn't standing in the same place while the world moves around you. Bravery is taking a step forward, even when you're terrified of where it might lead." Lydia felt the sting of tears and blinked them back furiously. "What would you have me do? I've tried everything. I've been pleasant. I've been gracious. I've pretended not to hear the whispers. Nothing changes. I am permanently marked by what he did. Only if you allow it." Cordelia's hand gently squeezed her niece's arm. Come to my salon tomorrow afternoon. I host gatherings every Tuesday. Writers, artists, intellectuals, people who care more about ideas than bloodlines, who value wit over wealth. You need new air to breathe, my dear. This world, she gestured dismissively at the glittering ballroom, is suffocating you. Mother would be horrified. Your mother is horrified by everything that doesn't result in a socially advantageous marriage. Live for yourself, Lydia, not for her ambitions or society's approval. Before Lydia could respond, a ripple of excitement moved through the gallery. Heads turned, fans snapped shut, and conversations paused mid-sentence. Lydia followed the collective gaze to see a tall figure ascending the main staircase, his presence commanding attention with effortless authority. The Duke of Greymore had arrived. Gabriel Thornton, 7th Duke of Greymore, was not a man who attended theatre balls. At 34, he had long since exhausted his patience for the marriage mart and its attendant rituals. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of athletic build that came from managing vast estates rather than lounging in London clubs. His hair was dark as coal, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, and his eyes were a striking grey that seemed to see through pretense and social niceties with uncomfortable clarity. He was also, by all accounts, unmarried, wealthy beyond imagination, and notoriously difficult to impress. "That's Greymore," Aunt Cordelia murmured, watching the Duke with interest. "He returned from his northern estates just last week. Rumour has it he's finally considering the necessity of an heir, though I suspect he'd rather negotiate a treaty with Napoleon than endure a London season." Lydia studied the Duke as he moved through the crowd. People parted for him naturally, the way water flows around a stone. He acknowledged greetings with polite nods, but didn't pause, his expression suggesting he was already regretting his decision to attend. There was something compelling about his discomfort, the way he wore his social obligations like an ill-fitting coat. "He looks absolutely miserable," Lydia observed. "Doesn't he?" Cordelia smiled. "I quite like him for it. At least he's honest about his disdain. Far preferable to the simpering fortune hunters who pretend enthusiasm while calculating dowries." The Duke's eyes swept the gallery, and for one strange, unsettling moment, his gaze locked with Lydia's. She felt a jolt of recognition, though they had never been introduced. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those grey eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or assessment. Then he looked away, and Lydia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Come," Cordelia said, drawing her back toward the ballroom. "Let's return before your brother sends out a search party." They descended to the main floor, just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. Lydia resumed her position by the pillar, Thomas materializing at her side with another glass of champagne and a concerned expression. "Aunt Cordelia was interrogating you about your life choices, wasn't she?" he asked. "How did you know?" "Because she cornered me at breakfast last week and delivered a 30-minute lecture on the dangers of complacency and wasted potential. I'm still recovering." Lydia laughed, the sound surprising her. It had been so long since she'd felt genuine amusement rather than practiced politeness. The evening wore on. The Duke of Greymore made his obligatory rounds, dancing with Lord Pemberton's daughter and Lady Harcher's niece, his expression one of patient endurance. Lydia watched him with the kind of detached interest one might give to an exotic animal at a menagerie, fascinating but entirely irrelevant to one's actual life. She was about to suggest to Thomas that they leave when the music stopped abruptly. The dancers paused mid-step, and a confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Lydia turned to see what had caused the disruption and felt her blood turn to ice. Edmund Blackwell stood at the center of the ballroom, his face flushed with champagne and something darker, a reckless anger that Lydia recognized from their courtship. Beside him, Beatrice clutched his arm, her face pale with distress, clearly trying to pull him away. "I would like to make a toast," Edmund announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Oh, God," Thomas breathed beside Lydia. "He's foxed." Lord Pemberton stepped forward, attempting damage control. "My lord, perhaps we should—" No, no, this needs to be said. Edmund shook off both his wife and the host, raising his champagne glass with exaggerated precision. 6 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I humiliated a lady before this very society, and I've regretted it every day since. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. Every eye in the ballroom found her, pinning her in place like a specimen under glass. Thomas's hand gripped her arm. Whether to support or restrain her, she couldn't tell. Lady Lydia Ashford, Edmund continued, his gaze finding her across the sea of horrified faces, was an innocent victim of my cowardice. I was weak. I chose passion over honor, love over duty, and I destroyed her life in the process. Edmund, stop, Beatrice pleaded, tears streaming down her pretty face. No, she deserves to hear this. They all deserve to hear this. He gestured wildly at the assembled guests. You all condemned her, whispered about her, treated her like she was somehow at fault. But the only guilty party here is me. I am the coward. I am the villain of this story. Lydia wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear, to wake up and discover this was another nightmare. But she was trapped, unable to move, unable to breathe, as Edmund Blackwell performed his very public penance. I thought confessing my love for Beatrice was the brave thing, he said, his voice breaking. I thought honesty mattered more than propriety, but all I did was replace one woman's unhappiness with another's. Beatrice hasn't had a single day of peace since we married. Every drawing room we enter, she feels the judgment. Every whisper, every turned back, she bears them because she loves me. And Lydia, he looked directly at her now, his eyes red-rimmed. Lydia bears them because I was too selfish to care about the consequences. That's quite enough. The Duke of Greymoor's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, cold and absolutely authoritative. Everyone turned to stare at him. He had moved to stand between Edmund and the crowd, his tall frame blocking the Viscount from view. His expression was neutral, but there was steel beneath the politeness. You're drunk, Blackwell. Whatever point you hope to make, you've achieved only further humiliation. For your wife, for Lady Lydia, and for yourself, I suggest you take Lady Blackwell home before you compound tonight's spectacle. Edmund swayed slightly, his moment of dramatic catharsis collapsing into confused shame. I was only trying to... I know what you were trying to do. The road to hell is paved with similar intentions. The Duke's grey eyes held no warmth. Take your wife home. Apologize to her, since she's the one who actually has to live with your choices. 2 footmen appeared, gently but firmly escorting Edmund toward the exit. Beatrice followed, her face buried in her hands, the very picture of mortification. Lord Pemberton called for the orchestra to resume, attempting to return the evening to normalcy, but the damage was done. Lydia stood frozen, her carefully constructed dignity shattered. 6 years of silent endurance, of maintaining grace under scrutiny, of proving she could survive, all of it undone in 5 minutes by a drunk man's guilty conscience. "We're leaving," Thomas said, his voice tight with fury. "Now!" But before they could move, the Duke of Greymoor materialized before them. Up close, he was even more imposing, his grey eyes now focused entirely on Lydia, with an intensity that made her want to flee. "Lady Lydia," he said, his voice low enough that only she and Thomas could hear, "I realize you don't know me, and propriety suggests I should make proper introductions before presuming to speak. But I'm going to ignore propriety because I suspect you've had enough of societal niceties for one evening." Lydia could only stare at him, words failing her completely. "I am leaving this godforsaken circus," the Duke continued. "I came because Pemberton guilted me into it, and I'm regretting every moment. However, before I go, I wanted to say that what just happened was not your fault, was not your shame, and anyone who treats it as such is a fool." He paused, something softening in his austere features. "You've stood alone at these events for far too long. Join me." "I beg your pardon," Lydia finally managed. "Leave with me." "Not in any improper sense," he added quickly. "Your brother can accompany us, but walk out of here on my arm, and let every person in this room see that the Duke of Greymore finds your company preferable to their circus." Thomas made a choking sound that might have been laughter or shock. Lydia felt dizzy, as though the world had tilted on its axis. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No, but I know enough. I know you've been punished for someone else's cowardice. I know you've endured 6 years of this." He gestured at the ballroom with barely concealed contempt. "With more grace than most of these people could manage for 6 minutes. And I know that Edmund Blackwell's drunken confessional just gave you the perfect opportunity to exit dramatically." He offered his arm. "So join me, Lady Lydia. Let's make your departure the story they tell, rather than his pathetic apology." For 6 years, Lydia had done what was expected. She had been gracious, forgiving, patient. She had stood in her corner and endured. But standing before her was a powerful duke, offering her an escape, offering her agency, offering her the chance to write her own story for the first time since Edmund walked away. She placed her hand on his arm. The ballroom noticed immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Fans paused in mid-flutter. The Duke of Greymore, the most eligible bachelor in England, was escorting the scandalous Lady Lydia from the ball. They walked through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Thomas followed, wearing an expression of stunned delight. Lord Pemberton attempted a polite farewell, but the Duke merely nodded, never slowing his pace. They descended the grand staircase, crossed the marble entrance hall, and stepped into the cold November night. The Duke's carriage was summoned, and within moments they were departing Theatre Royal, leaving behind a ballroom full of speculation and shock. Only when they were safely inside the carriage did Lydia allow herself to breathe. She looked at the Duke, sitting across from her with Thomas, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. Gabriel Thornton regarded her for a long moment. "Because I've spent the last hour watching you stand alone, bearing the weight of other people's judgment with quiet dignity. And then I watched Blackwell attempt to absolve his guilt by making a spectacle of you one more time." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was anger beneath it. "I thought you deserved an ally, even if just for one evening." "You don't even know me," she repeated, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. "Then perhaps it's time we remedied that." He smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed his austere features. "Tomorrow afternoon, there's a literary salon in Bloomsbury. Dreadful neighbourhood by Mayfair standards, hosted by a rather formidable woman named Lady Cordelia Blackwood. I believe she's your aunt." Lydia's eyes widened. "You know Aunt Cordelia. I attend her salons regularly. They're one of the few places in London where people discuss ideas rather than bloodlines." He leaned back, studying her with those unsettling grey eyes. "She mentioned you tonight, said she'd invited you to tomorrow's gathering. I hope you'll attend. I'd very much like to continue this acquaintance in a setting where neither of us is being judged by people whose opinions matter remarkably little." The carriage rolled through London streets, carrying Lydia away from the ballroom that had been her prison for 6 years, towards something unknown and terrifying and possibly wonderful. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'll be there." The Duke of Greymore smiled again, and Lydia felt the first stirrings of something she'd thought dead and buried. Hope. Lydia didn't sleep. She lay in her bed at Ashford House, watching dawn break over the London rooftops, replaying the previous evening in her mind. The horror of Edmund's drunken confession, the Duke's unexpected intervention, the feeling of walking out on his arm, every eye following them, every tongue preparing to wag. By breakfast, the scandal had already begun its inevitable circulation. Thomas brought the morning papers to the breakfast room, his expression hovering between amusement and concern. The Duke of Greymore made a surprising departure from Lord Pemberton's theatre ball last evening, escorting the long scandalized Lady Lydia Ashford, he read from the society column. Sources suggest His Grace took umbrage at Viscount Blackwell's shocking public apology, though whether his interest in Lady Lydia is chivalrous or romantic remains to be seen. Good Lord, they work fast. Lady Margaret entered the breakfast room like an avenging angel, still in her dressing gown, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Is it true? Did the Duke of Greymore actually escort you from the ball? Yes, Mother. Why? What did you say to him? What did you do? Thomas bristled. She didn't do anything except stand there while Edmund Blackwell made a drunken ass of himself. The Duke had the decency to offer her an escape. But why would he involve himself? Lady Margaret paced the room, her mind clearly racing through social calculations. The Duke never attends such events, never shows interest in society ladies. There must be some ulterior motive. Perhaps he simply disliked watching a woman be publicly humiliated, Lydia said quietly. Perhaps not every action requires a calculated motive. Her mother stopped pacing, her expression softening slightly. I only want to understand, dear. If the Duke has taken an interest in you, we must be strategic. This could be your opportunity to... To what, Mother? To trap a Duke? To manipulate his kindness into a marriage proposal? Lydia set down her teacup with deliberate care. I'm going to Aunt Cordelia's salon this afternoon. The Duke mentioned he attends regularly. Perhaps I'll learn more about his character than I ever could from speculation. Cordelia's salon. Lady Margaret's face paled. Lydia, you cannot. Those gatherings are full of radicals and freethinkers, artists and writers of questionable morals. If you're seen there, especially now, people will think, let them think whatever they wish. They've been doing so for 6 years. Lydia stood, her decision crystallizing with each word. I'm tired of living my life according to other people's opinions. Aunt Cordelia has offered me friendship and intellectual stimulation. The Duke has offered me courtesy. Both are more than I've received from society's so-called respectable circles. She left the breakfast room. Before her mother could mount further objections, Thomas's voice drifting after her with words of encouragement. In her chamber, Lydia stood before her wardrobe, studying the rows of beautiful gowns, chosen more for armor than adornment. Today required something different, something that represented not the woman she'd been forced to become, but the woman she might have been if Edmund had never walked away. She chose a dress of deep burgundy, simpler than her ball gowns, but elegantly tailored. Her lady's maid arranged her hair in a softer style, with loose curls framing her face. When Lydia studied herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked less like a defensive monument and more like an actual person. It was terrifying. Aunt Cordelia's house in Bloomsbury was an elegant townhouse on Bedford Square, its exterior modest by Mayfair standards, but its interior absolutely alive with personality. Books lined every wall, artwork from various periods hung in cheerful disarray, and the scent of tea and lemon cakes filled the air. Voices drifted from the drawing room, animated, passionate conversations about philosophy and poetry and politics. A butler showed Lydia inside, and Cordelia swept forward to greet her, resplendent in violet silk, with a paisley shawl draped over her shoulders. "You came! I confess I wasn't certain you would, especially after last night's drama." She kissed Lydia's cheek warmly. "Though I must say, leaving on the Duke's arm was a brilliant stroke. London is positively abuzz. I didn't plan it. The best moments rarely are planned." Cordelia linked arms with her niece, guiding her toward the drawing room. "Now, don't be nervous. My guests are peculiar, but kind. They'll judge you on your wit, not your past." They entered the drawing room, and Lydia's first impression was of controlled chaos. Perhaps 20 people occupied the space, men and women mixing freely, seated on sofas and chairs and floor cushions, in casual disregard for propriety. A woman with wild auburn hair was reading poetry aloud, while others listened or debated or sketched. A distinguished gentleman with paint-stained fingers argued passionately with a younger man about the merits of Turner's latest exhibition. And in the corner by the window, nursing a cup of tea and looking almost relaxed, sat the Duke of Greymore. He rose when he saw Lydia, his expression brightening with genuine pleasure. "Lady Lydia, you accepted the invitation." "I did." She felt suddenly shy, unsure of herself in a way she hadn't experienced since her debut. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Nonsense," Cordelia declared. "You belong here far more than half the preening peacocks at those dreadful balls. Come, let me introduce you." The next hour passed in a blur of names and faces and fascinating conversations. Lydia met Mr. Jonathan Reeves, a novelist whose latest work had scandalized the conservative press. Miss Amelia Thornbury, a painter who displayed her works under a male pseudonym. Dr. Henry Wickham, a physician who advocated for improved conditions in London's hospitals. These were people who created things, who thought about ideas, who existed outside the rigid hierarchies that had defined Lydia's entire life, and they welcomed her without hesitation. No one mentioned Edmund or the scandal. No one treated her with pity or judgment. They asked her opinions on Byron's poetry, debated with her about the social contract, listened when she spoke rather than simply waiting for her to finish so they could return to more important matters. It was intoxicating. "You seem surprised," the Duke said, appearing at her elbow with a fresh cup of tea. They had gravitated toward each other throughout the afternoon, natural allies in a room full of comfortable strangers. He had an easy manner here, so different from his austere formality at the ball. He laughed at Mr. Reeves's witty observations and engaged Dr. Wickham in serious discussion about rural healthcare. This was clearly his element. "I am surprised," Lydia admitted. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a cautionary tale. These people don't care about cautionary tales. They're too busy writing their own scandalous stories." He smiled, gesturing toward Miss Thornbury, who was currently demonstrating an artistic technique to an enraptured audience. "Amelia has been rejected by the Royal Academy 3 times because she refuses to submit her work under a man's name. Dr. Wickham nearly lost his license for treating cholera patients when other physicians refused. Reeves was almost imprisoned for his political satire. They're a collection of misfits and rebels, which is precisely why Cordelia adores them. And why you attend. I attend because I'm tired of conversations about bloodlines and property and who's marrying whom for what strategic advantage." His grey eyes met hers with uncomfortable honesty. "I've been the Duke of Greymore since I was 23. 11 years of everyone wanting something from me, my title, my wealth, my connections. Here, I'm just Gabriel, a man who reads too much and has opinions about enclosure laws and thinks most of London society is performing an elaborate pantomime." Lydia laughed, startled by his candour. "You seemed rather comfortable performing that pantomime last night." "I'm an excellent actor when required. One learns when one's born into a role with no possibility of escape." He paused, studying her. "You understand that, I think. You've been performing for 6 years. The dignified spinster, the woman who moved on. But I wonder who you actually are beneath the performance." The question struck deeper than Lydia expected. "I'm not sure I remember anymore." "Then perhaps it's time to rediscover." Before she could respond, Cordelia clapped her hands, calling the room to attention. "My dears, we have a new member joining us today. Lady Lydia Ashford, my brilliant niece, who has been wasting her considerable intellect standing in ballroom corners when she should have been here, arguing with us about art and literature and the fate of the nation." There was a murmur of welcome, and Lydia felt heat rise to her cheeks. But it wasn't embarrassment. It was something warmer, something that felt dangerously like belonging. "Now then," Cordelia continued, "next week we're discussing Mr. Reeves's new manuscript, which is absolutely scandalous and therefore required reading. Lydia, I'm assigning you the first 3 chapters. Come prepared to defend or eviscerate. He needs honest feedback, not polite praise." "I haven't agreed to—" Lydia began. "Of course you have. You're here, aren't you?" Cordelia winked. "Welcome to the family, my dear." The afternoon extended into early evening. Lydia found herself in a corner with Gabriel. "Dr. Wickham?" and Miss Thornbury, debating the responsibility of artists to society. The conversation was passionate and occasionally heated, but it was real. No one performed for anyone else. No one calculated the social advantage of each statement. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, Miss Thornbury declared, her green eyes flashing with conviction. If my paintings make people uncomfortable with their assumptions about women's capabilities, then I've succeeded. But can art create actual change? Gabriel asked. Or does it simply allow the privileged to feel virtuous while the structures of inequality remain intact? Both can be true, Lydia heard herself say. All eyes turned to her, and she felt a flutter of nervousness but pressed on. Art creates the cultural conditions for change. It shifts perception, challenges assumptions. That doesn't immediately alter laws or redistribute wealth, but it plants seeds. Some of those seeds become revolutions. Gabriel's expression shifted, something like respect or perhaps intrigue flickering across his features. Well argued, Lady Lydia. Thank you, Your Grace. Gabriel, please, we've already caused enough scandal. We might as well be informal. Then you must call me Lydia. The intimacy of first names felt both terrifying and thrilling. Around them the salon continued its cheerful chaos, but Lydia felt cocooned in this small circle, protected by intellectual passion and genuine camaraderie. I should go, she said reluctantly as the light began to fade outside. My mother will be pacing the floors, imagining all manner of radical corruption. I'll escort you, Gabriel said immediately. It's nearly dark, and even Bloomsbury's intellectual rebellion has its rough elements. They made their farewells, Cordelia extracting a firm promise from Lydia to return next week. As Gabriel handed her into his carriage, Lydia caught Miss Thornbury's eye and received a knowing wink. Clearly the artist saw more than casual courtesy in the Duke's attention. The carriage rolled toward Mayfair, and Lydia and Gabriel sat in companionable silence for several minutes. The day had been overwhelming in the best possible way, and Lydia needed time to process. You were magnificent this afternoon, Gabriel said quietly. Lydia laughed, surprised. I barely said anything. You said enough, and you listened, which is rarer than you might think. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Lydia, I want to be honest about something. When I approached you last night, it wasn't entirely spontaneous. Her heart sank. Oh? Cordelia had mentioned you earlier. She told me about the scandal, about your 6 years of silent endurance. She said you were wasting away in polite society when you belonged somewhere you could actually breathe. He paused, choosing words carefully. I came to that ball specifically hoping to meet you. When Blackwell created his spectacle, I seized the opportunity. Lydia didn't know whether to feel grateful or manipulated. Why? Why would you involve yourself in my situation? Because I understand what it's like to be trapped by other people's expectations. My entire life has been dictated by an accident of birth. I didn't choose to be Duke of Greymore. My older brother was meant for that role. He died in a riding accident when I was 23, and suddenly I was thrust into this position I'd never prepared for, never wanted. His voice carried old pain. Everyone wants something from me. Everyone has expectations. The title isn't freedom, it's a cage made of gold and duty. But surely you could refuse, walk away from it all. What? Could I? And do what? Leave my tenants without support? Abandon estates that employ hundreds? Ignore the political responsibilities that come with my seat in Lords? He shook his head. No, the cage is real, even if others can't see the bars. So I attend Cordelia's salon and pretend for a few hours each week that I'm just a man with opinions, rather than a duke with obligations. Lydia understood more than she wanted to admit. Why tell me this? Because I want you to know that my interest in your acquaintance is genuine. Not because I'm collecting charitable causes or trying to scandalize society, but because I think we might understand each other in ways most people can't. The carriage stopped outside Ashford House. Gabriel descended first, offering his hand to help her down. On the doorstep, Lydia turned to face him, suddenly aware of how much had changed in less than 24 hours. "Thank you," she said simply, "for last night, for today, for seeing me as more than a scandal. Thank you for reminding me that there are still interesting people in London if one knows where to look." He bowed formally, but his smile was warm. "Until next Tuesday?" "Until next Tuesday." Lydia entered her house feeling lighter than she had in years, unaware that inside another storm was brewing. Lady Margaret was waiting in the drawing room, her expression a complicated mixture of hope and anxiety. Beside her sat a portly man in expensive but ill-fitting clothes, Mr. Cornelius Hartford, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in textiles and was desperately attempting to purchase his way into respectability through strategic marriages. "Lydia, dear," her mother said with forced brightness, "Mr. Hartford has called to pay his respects. He read about your association with the Duke of Greymore and wished to express his admiration." Translation: he smelled an opportunity to attach himself to potential ducal connections. Lydia sank into a chair, exhaustion from the day's emotional upheaval making diplomacy difficult. "Mr. Hartford, how kind of you to call." "Lady Lydia, I must say, your resilience in the face of past difficulties is most admirable." His voice was nasal, his smile revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "A woman of your refinement and breeding, wronged by that scoundrel Blackwell. I've always said society treated you abominably." "Have you? I wasn't aware we'd ever met." "Well, no, not formally, but I've long observed your dignity from afar." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "I understand the Duke of Greymore is paying you particular attention, most fortuitous. A connection to such an elevated title would benefit any family." There it was, the true purpose of his visit. He wanted to position himself advantageously should her association with Gabriel develop into something more permanent. The crass calculation made Lydia's skin crawl. "The Duke and I are barely acquainted, Mr. Hartford. I'm sure his interest, if it exists at all, is purely courteous." Now, don't be modest. A man of his stature doesn't escort just any lady from a ball. Mark my words, he sees your quality. And when he proposes, as I'm certain he will, your family's status will be greatly elevated. I hope you'll remember old friends when that happy day arrives." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression murderous. "Old friends? You've never spoken to my sister before this evening, you opportunistic leech." "Thomas!" Lady Margaret gasped. "No, Mother, this is absurd. Lydia spends one evening in the Duke's company, and suddenly every social climber in London is presenting himself as a long-lost admirer." He crossed to Mr. Hartford, looming over the smaller man. "My sister is not an investment opportunity. I suggest you leave before I assist you to the door in a manner you won't find pleasant." Mr. Hartford departed with wounded dignity, and Lady Margaret rounded on her son. "How dare you, Mr. Hartford is quite wealthy, and if he wishes to associate with this family, he wishes to exploit Lydia's potential connection to the Duke, just as every other schemer in London will attempt to do." Thomas turned to his sister, his anger softening to concern. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Your name is attached to Greymore's now. Every gossip, every fortune hunter, every person who ignored you for 6 years will suddenly remember your existence." Lydia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of new complications settling over her. She had escaped one prison, only to find herself in another, this time as an object of speculation and strategic maneuvering. "What do I do?" she asked quietly. "You do exactly what you've been doing," Thomas said firmly. "You attend Aunt Cordelia's salon. You live your life. And if the Duke's interest is genuine, it will survive the circus. If it's not, then at least you'll have discovered that sooner rather than later." The following week brought an onslaught of attention that made Lydia nostalgic for her days of invisibility. Invitations flooded Ashford House. Suddenly everyone wanted Lady Lydia Ashford at their dinners, soirees and musical evenings. Old acquaintances who had crossed the street to avoid her now called to reminisce about their close friendship. Gentlemen, who had never given her a second glance, appeared with flowers and poetry. Lydia declined most invitations, accepting only those from genuine friends or events she had previously planned to attend. But she couldn't entirely escape the speculation and attention. The gossip columns were relentless. The Duke and the discarded lady, a romance or mere pity? Will Greymore rescue the scandalous spinster? Sources suggest Duke's interest in Lady L more than charitable. Through it all, Gabriel maintained a careful distance. He didn't call at Ashford House, didn't send flowers or poetry, didn't feed the gossip mill with public displays. At first, Lydia assumed he was regretting his involvement. Then Cordelia explained. "He's protecting you," her aunt said during their weekly Tuesday salon. "The more attention he gives you publicly, the more society will assume you've trapped him somehow. If he maintains polite distance while continuing to see you here, in private intellectual circles, it suggests genuine friendship rather than romantic pursuit. He's quite strategic when he chooses to be." Indeed, at the salons, Gabriel was warm and attentive. They fell into easy conversation, discovering shared views on literature and politics. He introduced her to his favorite authors, debated with her about social reform, listened when she expressed opinions that would have scandalized her mother's drawing room. Their friendship deepened naturally, without performance or calculation. Lydia found herself looking forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation that felt both wonderful and dangerous. 3 weeks after the theatre ball, Lord Pemberton hosted another entertainment, a winter gala at his Mayfair mansion. Lydia initially declined, having no desire to revisit the scene of her latest humiliation, but Thomas convinced her to attend. "You can't hide forever," he argued. "Show them you're not afraid. Besides, the Duke will be there, and I suspect he'd appreciate an ally in that social warfare." So Lydia donned a gown of midnight blue velvet, arranged her hair elegantly, and steeled herself for another evening of scrutiny. The Pemberton townhouse glowed with candlelight and winter greenery. Lydia arrived with Thomas, immediately aware of the whispers that followed her entrance. But this time, something was different. The whispers weren't all cruel. Some were curious, some were even admiring. The scandal of the theatre ball had shifted public perception in unexpected ways. Edmund's confession had confirmed what many had privately suspected, that Lydia had been innocent of any wrongdoing. The Duke's defense of her suggested she had powerful allies, and her continued dignity in the face of renewed attention earned grudging respect. Lydia was no longer simply the scandalous Lady Ashford. She had become interesting. "Lady Lydia," a cool voice said beside her. She turned to find herself face to face with Lady Victoria Fairmont, daughter of an earl and one of London's premier tastemakers. They had been friends once before the scandal. Victoria had cut her completely after Edmund's departure. "Lady Victoria," Lydia replied cautiously. "I wanted to apologize." Victoria's beautiful face showed genuine discomfort. "I believed the worst of you when I should have known better. Edmund Blackwell's confession confirmed what I should have realized years ago. You were blameless. You're apologizing now because it's socially advantageous, now that the Duke has taken an interest." Lydia kept her voice level but cold. Victoria winced, but didn't deny it. "Partially, yes. I'm not going to claim I'm suddenly enlightened and immune to social calculations, but also because I genuinely regret my treatment of you. You deserved better from your friends." She paused. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I was wrong." It was more honesty than Lydia had expected. "Thank you for saying so." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Victoria excused herself. As she walked away, Thomas appeared with champagne. "Did Lady Fairmont just apologize to you?" he asked, incredulous. "In her way, yes. The Duke's influence is remarkable. Everyone who ignored you for 6 years is suddenly re-evaluating their position. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or cynical. Be both. It's healthier." Thomas handed her the champagne. "Now come. The Duke just arrived, and he's heading this way. Try to look pleased rather than terrified." Gabriel cut through the crowd with his usual authority, his evening attire impeccable, his expression warming when he saw Lydia. He greeted Thomas cordially before turning his attention to her. "Lady Lydia, you look lovely this evening." "Your Grace, I'm surprised to see you at another Pemberton event. I thought you'd sworn off such gatherings." "I had, but Pemberton made an impassioned case about supporting the arts. The gala benefits a theatre restoration fund, and I confess I was curious whether you'd attend, given last time's unfortunate events." "I was curious about the same thing regarding you," he smiled. "Then we're both braver than sense would dictate. Shall we brave it together?" Before Lydia could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Edmund Blackwell had arrived with Beatrice, both looking uncomfortable and rather desperate. Clearly, they were attempting to rehabilitate their own reputation after the theatre ball disaster. "This should be interesting," Thomas murmured. Edmund made directly for their group, his face set with determination. Beatrice followed reluctantly, her pretty features marked with anxiety. "Duke Greymore, Lady Lydia, may I have a word?" Edmund asked formally. Gabriel's expression went glacially polite. "I'm not certain there's anything left to say, Blackwell. Please, just a moment." Edmund looked at Lydia, and she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Lady Lydia, I owe you a proper apology. Not a drunken spectacle, but a real acknowledgement of the harm I caused." "Edmund, don't," Beatrice whispered, but he pressed on. "6 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life, not marrying Beatrice. I don't regret loving her, but the manner in which I ended our engagement was unforgivable. I destroyed your reputation, your social standing, your future prospects. And I did it publicly because I was a coward who thought dramatic honesty was the same as bravery." Lydia felt the ballroom's attention focusing on them, history repeating itself in uncomfortable ways. But this time, she wasn't frozen. This time, she had allies. "Your apology is 6 years too late, Edmund," she said quietly, "but I accept it, not because you deserve absolution, but because I'm tired of carrying the weight of your choices." "I don't deserve absolution," he agreed. "But I wanted you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You would have made a far better Duchess than most of these so-called ladies of quality. Your intelligence, your strength, your grace under impossible circumstances. I was a fool to—" "Stop!" Gabriel's voice cut through Edmund's confession like a knife. "You're doing it again, Blackwell, making a public spectacle of Lady Lydia while pretending it's for her benefit. This isn't about apologizing. It's about absolving yourself." "Again!" Edmund's face reddened. "I'm trying to make amends." "Then do so privately, with genuine action rather than public performance. Lady Lydia doesn't need your belated recognition of her worth. She never did." Gabriel stepped closer to Lydia, a subtle but unmistakable claiming of alliance. "Now, if you'll excuse us, you've interrupted our evening quite enough." He offered Lydia his arm, and she took it gratefully. They walked away from Edmund and Beatrice, leaving them standing alone while whispers erupted around them. "Thank you," Lydia breathed when they reached a quieter corner. "I'm not sure I could have—" "You were handling it beautifully. I simply dislike watching people use you as their confessional." His grey eyes held suppressed anger. "Blackwell's apologies are all about his guilt, not your healing. He wants to feel better about himself at your expense. You've thought about this quite a lot." "I've thought about you quite a lot." The admission came out before he seemed to consider it, and his expression shifted to surprise at his own honesty. Lydia felt her breath catch. They stood in an alcove, partially hidden from the ballroom, the noise of the party distant and muffled. Gabriel was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his carefully controlled expression warred with something more vulnerable. "Lydia, I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "When I first approached you, it was because Cordelia asked me to look out for you. But somewhere in these past weeks, my motivation changed. I don't see you as a charitable cause or a scandal to defend. I see you as a remarkable woman whose company I value more than anyone else's in this entire city. Gabriel, let me finish. I know this is complicated. I know everyone is watching, speculating, assuming I'm either rescuing you or taking advantage. But I need you to know that my regard for you is genuine. It has nothing to do with pity and everything to do with admiration. Before Lydia could respond, Lady Margaret appeared, her face flushed with excitement and calculation. "Lydia, the Duke of Greymoor, how wonderful to see you both together. Your Grace, you simply must join us for dinner next week. I insist." "We would be honored." "Mother, please," Lydia interrupted, mortified, but Gabriel handled it with gracious firmness. "You're very kind, Lady Margaret, but my schedule is quite full. However, I hope Lady Lydia will continue to attend Lady Cordelia's gatherings. I find her perspective invaluable to our discussions." He bowed and excused himself, leaving Lydia alone with her mother, who immediately began strategizing ways to secure a more formal courtship. Lydia barely heard her, her mind still processing Gabriel's confession. He valued her, not her potential connections, not her dowry, not her family name. Her. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating revelation of her life. The winter progressed, and London society remained fixated on the question of whether the Duke of Greymoor would propose to Lady Lydia Ashford. Every interaction was scrutinized, every conversation dissected for hidden meaning. Lydia found the attention exhausting, but learned to navigate it with increasing confidence. What sustained her through the gossip and speculation was the quiet certainty that had developed between her and Gabriel. They continued to meet at Cordelia's salons, their friendship deepening into something neither of them had quite named, but both recognized as significant. They discussed everything: philosophy, politics, literature, their fears and hopes, and the weight of expectations they both carried. Gabriel told her about his brother James, who had died in a riding accident that everyone whispered was actually suicide, about the guilt of inheriting a title that should never have been his, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted his position rather than his person. Lydia shared her own story in fuller detail, not just Edmund's rejection, but the years before it, when she'd been groomed for perfection, taught that her value lay in her accomplishments and connections rather than her authentic self. How the scandal had been devastating, but also strangely liberating, forcing her to confront who she was beneath the performance. "I spent 22 years learning to be the perfect lady," she told him, during one salon evening, sitting by the fire while others debated across the room. "And then it all fell apart in one morning. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd been taught to value, gone. For a long time I thought that meant I was nothing, but now I wonder if maybe I was always nothing when I was trying to be perfect. Maybe losing everything gave me the chance to become real." Gabriel studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "You are the most real person I know, Lydia. Everyone else is performing, including me most of the time, but with you I feel like I can be honest. Just Gabriel, not the Duke. And I'm just Lydia with you, not the scandalous lady, not the tragic figure, just myself." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the murmur of friendly conversation filling Cordelia's drawing room. It was the most intimate moment Lydia had experienced in years, and it required no physical touch, no dramatic declarations, just two people, seen and accepted. The question of marriage hung between them, unspoken but increasingly present. Gabriel never formally courted her, no public displays, no official calls at Ashford House with flowers and poetry, but his attention was unmistakable. He found reasons to extend their conversations, to seek her opinion, to ensure she was never standing alone at the few public events they both attended. It was Thomas who finally addressed it directly. "He's going to propose," he said one January afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park. "Everyone knows it, the only question is when." "You can't possibly know that." "Bless you. Lydia, the Duke of Greymoor, a man who has rebuffed every marriage-minded mama in London for 11 years, is spending all his free time in the company of a woman the gossips call scandalous. He's not collecting intellectual companions. He's courting you in the only way he knows how, honestly, privately, without all the performative nonsense society demands. Lydia's heart raced. What if he doesn't? What if everyone's expectations are pushing him towards something he doesn't actually want? Then he'll tell you so. Gabriel Thornton is many things, but dishonest isn't one of them. Thomas squeezed her arm. The real question is, what do you want? It was the question Lydia had been avoiding. Did she want to marry Gabriel? The practical answer was obvious. Becoming a duchess would restore her social standing, secure her future, validate every painful year she'd endured. Her mother certainly thought so, planning the hypothetical wedding with increasing fervor. But Lydia had learned not to trust practical answers. Edmund had been the practical choice, and that had ended in disaster. "I want to be chosen," she said slowly. "Not rescued, not pitied, not seen as an opportunity. I want to be valued for who I actually am, not who society thinks I should be." And has Gabriel ever given you reason to doubt? That's exactly how he sees you. She thought about their conversations, the way he listened when she spoke, the intellectual respect he showed her opinions, the comfort of his presence. No, he hasn't. Then maybe stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and allow yourself to be happy. The proposal came not with grand gestures or public spectacle, but in the quiet sanctuary of Cordelia's library during a March salon. Lydia had retreated from the drawing room to find a book they'd been discussing, and Gabriel had followed. "Running away from Mr. Reeves's passionate defense of Gothic fiction?" he asked, entering the library and closing the door behind him. "More like seeking shelter. He's been arguing for 20 minutes without pausing for breath." Gabriel laughed, moving to stand beside her at the bookshelf. The library was small and cozy, lined with volumes that ranged from ancient philosophy to scandalous contemporary novels. A single window overlooked the garden, where early spring flowers were attempting to bloom. "Lydia, I need to ask you something." His voice had changed, still calm, but with an undercurrent of nervousness she'd never heard before. She turned to face him, her heart suddenly hammering. "Yes? These past months have been the happiest I can remember. Not because of dramatic events or social triumph, but because I've had someone to share ideas with, someone who understands the weight of expectation and the longing for authenticity." He took a breath, his grey eyes holding hers. "I don't want to court you according to society's rules. I don't want to reduce what we have to a strategic marriage. But I very much want to spend the rest of my life having conversations with you." It wasn't a traditional proposal. There was no kneeling, no flowery poetry, no declarations of undying passion. It was honest and awkward and absolutely perfect. "Is that a proposal, Gabriel?" "It's a very bad proposal," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "I should have prepared something eloquent, but eloquence feels dishonest when the truth is simpler. I love you, Lydia. Not the perfect lady you were trained to be, not the scandalous figure society created, but the real you, the woman who debates philosophy and argues politics and finds freedom in intellectual honesty. Will you marry me? Not to escape your past, but to build our future?" Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes. Not because you're a duke, not because marrying you redeems my reputation, but because you see me, actually see me, not the performance. Yes, Gabriel, I'll marry you." He stepped closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you? I realize I should have asked first, but—" She kissed him, cutting off his nervous rambling. It was sweet and tentative, and nothing like the passionate embraces described in novels. It was real, two people learning each other, building something genuine rather than performing romance. When they separated, Gabriel's usual composure had cracked, revealing genuine joy. "We should probably tell Cordelia before she bursts in, demanding to know what's taking so long. She'll claim credit for the entire match. She deserves it. Without her salon, we would never have met properly." They returned to the drawing room hand in hand, and Cordelia took one look at their faces before clapping her hands in delight. "Finally! I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you both in the library." The news spread through London with predictable speed. The Duke of Greymoor was engaged to Lady Lydia Ashford. The gossip columns exploded with speculation. Was it a love match or strategic alliance? Had she trapped him? Was he rescuing her? But Gabriel and Lydia ignored the speculation. They planned a quiet wedding at Gabriel's estate in Northumberland, far from London's scrutiny. Lydia involved herself in learning about the duchy's management, discovering a talent for estate administration that surprised everyone except Gabriel. "You were always meant for more than drawing-room politeness," he told her as they reviewed tenant concerns one April afternoon. "Your mind was wasted on embroidery and musical performances. Society doesn't value intellectual women. Then we'll create our own society. Our estates will be a refuge for thinkers and artists. We'll host salons like Cordelia's, but in the countryside where radical ideas can flourish without scandal." His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement. "What's the point of being a duke if I can't use the position to shelter people who don't fit conventional molds?" It was this vision of a life built on authentic values rather than social performance that made Lydia certain she'd made the right choice. The wedding was set for late May. Lady Margaret had initial objections to the private ceremony, preferring a grand London spectacle. But Gabriel was firm. "This wedding is for Lydia and me, not for London gossip. We'll do it our way." 1 week before the ceremony, Edmund Blackwell requested a private audience with Lydia. She almost refused, but curiosity won. They met in the Ashford House drawing room, Thomas strategically present in the adjoining room. Edmund looked older, his handsome face marked with lines of regret and something like unhappiness. "Congratulations on your engagement," he began formally. "The Duke is a fortunate man." "Thank you, Edmund. Was that all you wished to say?" "No. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I couldn't see 6 years ago. You weren't just a suitable match, you were the better match. Beatrice is lovely and I care for her, but we're not equals. Not in the way you and Greymoor clearly are." He paused, pain crossing his features. "I thought love was enough. I was wrong. Partnership matters, respect matters. You tried to tell me that during our courtship, but I was too young and stupid to listen. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know that walking away from that altar was the worst mistake of my life. Not because I wanted to marry you, we both know that would have been disastrous for everyone involved, but because of how I did it. I humiliated you to free myself, and I've regretted it every day since." His voice broke slightly. "You're going to be happy with Greymoor. That's clear to anyone with eyes. And I'm glad. You deserve happiness. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I destroyed, and I'm sorry." It was the apology she'd needed 6 years ago. Now it felt anticlimactic, a footnote to a story that had already found its proper ending. "I forgive you, Edmund. Not because your apology changes anything, but because I don't want to carry anger into my new life." He nodded, understanding that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation or absolution. It simply meant Lydia was choosing to move forward without the weight of old resentments. After he left, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "How do you feel?" "Free," Lydia said, surprised by the truth of it. "I spent 6 years defined by what he did to me. But I'm not anymore. I'm just Lydia, about to marry a man who values me, about to start a life I actually chose." She smiled. "I'm finally free." Greymoor Castle stood in the wild beauty of Northumberland, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient forests. It was magnificent, but not ostentatious. A medieval structure modified over centuries into something that felt lived in rather than merely impressive. Lydia fell in love with it immediately. The wedding took place in the castle's private chapel, witnessed by only their closest friends and family. Cordelia wept happily throughout the ceremony. Thomas gave Lydia away with fierce pride. Lady Margaret looked vaguely disappointed by the lack of spectacle, but couldn't deny her daughter's obvious joy. Mr. Jonathan Reeves read poetry. Miss Amelia Thornbury sketched the ceremony. Dr. Henry Wickham proposed a toast about the healing power of authentic connection. It was unconventional and perfect and absolutely right. 6 months into their marriage, Lydia stood in the library of Greymore Castle, a vast room that occupied an entire wing, and marvelled at how completely her life had transformed. She was now the Duchess of Greymore, but the title felt less important than the actual life she was building. Gabriel had been true to his vision. They had established regular salons at the castle, inviting intellectuals and artists and anyone whose ideas outpaced society's acceptance. Their gatherings had become legendary, a place where women could voice political opinions, where scientists could debate controversial theories, where artists could experiment without judgment. Lydia had discovered an unexpected talent for estate management and social reform. She worked with Dr. Wickham to establish a small hospital for tenant families. She created a school where children, both boys and girls, could receive education regardless of their parents' ability to pay. She used her position to advocate for policies that actually helped people rather than merely preserving aristocratic privilege. "You're more radical than I expected," Gabriel teased one evening as they reviewed plans for expanding the tenant school. "You married a scandalous woman. What did you expect?" "I expected brilliance. I got revolution." He kissed her temple. "I'm not complaining." Their marriage was everything Lydia had never dared hope for. They were partners, intellectually, politically, emotionally. Gabriel consulted her on duchy decisions. Lydia challenged him when she disagreed. They argued passionately about ideas and laughed at the absurdity of London gossip that still occasionally reached them in the north. News from London came through Cordelia's letters and Thomas's periodic visits. Edmund and Beatrice had retreated to his country estate, their marriage reportedly strained by years of social ostracism. Lady Victoria Fairmont had married a baron and settled into respectable obscurity. The Ton had found new scandals to obsess over, and Lydia Ashford's story had faded into legend. The woman who stood alone for 6 years until a duke whispered, "Join me," and transformed her life. But Lydia knew the truth was more complex. Gabriel hadn't rescued her. Cordelia's salon had given her space to rediscover herself. Gabriel had simply recognized what she'd already become and offered partnership rather than salvation. One December evening, exactly 1 year after Gabriel's proposal, they hosted a Christmas salon. The castle was filled with guests, artists and writers and reformers, all gathered by the great hearth with mulled wine and spirited conversation. Snow fell outside, transforming Northumberland into a fairy tale landscape. Lydia stood at the window, watching the snow, when Gabriel joined her. "Happy?" "Impossibly so." She leaned into him. "A year ago, I was standing in ballroom corners, invisible and alone. Now I'm surrounded by friends, doing work that matters, married to a man I actually love. It feels like someone else's life." "It's your life. You built it." "We built it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." "I think you underestimate your strength. You survived 6 years of social death with your dignity intact. You would have found your way eventually, with or without me. Maybe. But I'm glad it was with you." They returned to their guests, and Lydia found herself drawn into a passionate debate about women's education with Miss Thornbury and several visiting scholars. She argued her points with confidence, backed by experience from the school she'd established. No one questioned her right to have opinions. No one suggested she was stepping beyond her proper sphere. This was the life she'd been meant for all along. Not performing perfection in a Mayfair drawing room, but engaging authentically with ideas and people and work that mattered. Later that night, after the guests had retired, Lydia and Gabriel sat in their private chambers, the fire crackling comfortably. Gabriel was reading estate reports, while Lydia worked on correspondence with Dr. Wickham about expanding medical services. It was domestic and ordinary and absolutely perfect. "I was thinking," Gabriel said, setting aside his papers, "we should visit London in the spring, attend one of Pemberton's theatre balls." Lydia looked up in surprise. "Why would we do that?" Because I want to walk into that ballroom with you on my arm as my Duchess. I want everyone who whispered and judged and ostracized you to see what you've become. Not because I need to prove anything to them, but because you deserve that moment. I don't need vindication, Gabriel. I have everything I want here. I know, but wouldn't it be satisfying just once to show them exactly what they missed? Lydia considered it. Once the idea of returning triumphant would have meant everything. Now it felt less important, but still, perhaps worthwhile. Not for revenge, but for closure. All right, she agreed. One ball. We make an appearance, dance together, and leave. But I'm not staying all evening. We have too much real work to do here to waste time on London gossip. Gabriel laughed. That's my Duchess. Practical to the end. They attended Lord Pemberton's spring theatre ball in April, arriving with calculated elegance. Lydia wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, Gabriel's family sapphires at her throat. She looked every inch the Duchess, poised, confident, beautiful. But more importantly, she felt like herself. The ballroom went nearly silent when they entered. Every eye tracked their progress as Gabriel escorted Lydia across the floor. But this time, the attention didn't feel like judgment. It felt like acknowledgement. Lord Pemberton greeted them warmly. Lady Victoria Fairmont approached with genuine congratulations. Even Lady Margaret, attending with Thomas, looked genuinely proud rather than strategically calculating. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" Gabriel asked formally, his eyes twinkling. "You may, Your Grace," Lydia replied with equal formality. They waltzed in the center of the ballroom, the same space where Edmund had delivered his drunken confession, where Lydia had stood frozen and humiliated. Now she glided gracefully in her husband's arms, her head high, her smile genuine. "Everyone's watching us," she murmured. "Let them watch. Let them see what you've become. Let them see what they lost when they chose cruelty over kindness." "What I've become," Lydia corrected, "is someone who doesn't need their approval. That's the real victory." When the dance ended, they didn't linger. They made polite farewells and departed, leaving London's elite to speculate about the Duchess, who had everything and needed nothing from their world. In the carriage heading back to Greymoor, Lydia rested her head on Gabriel's shoulder. "Thank you for tonight, but I'm glad we're going home." "Home," Gabriel repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, that's exactly what it is." That they returned to Northumberland, to their castle full of books and radical ideas and people who valued substance over status. They returned to their work, their conversations, their life built on genuine partnership rather than social performance. Lydia had stood alone at every theatre ball for 6 years, bearing the weight of other people's judgment and her own shattered dreams. But she hadn't been waiting for rescue. She'd been surviving, enduring, preparing, becoming the woman who could recognize authentic partnership when it was offered. Gabriel hadn't rescued her. He'd simply recognized her worth and offered companionship for the journey forward. Together, they had built something rare in their world, a marriage based on mutual respect, intellectual equality, and genuine affection. 6 years of standing alone had taught Lydia that her value didn't depend on social approval or romantic validation. She was enough all by herself, but she'd also learned that being enough alone didn't mean she couldn't choose partnership. The key was choosing someone who valued the real her, not the performance. And in Gabriel Thornton, Duke of Greymoor, she had found exactly that. A man who whispered, "Join me," and meant it as an invitation to partnership, not a command to conform. They lived at Greymoor Castle, hosting salons and reforming estates, and slowly, quietly changing their corner of the world. They argued about philosophy and laughed at society's scandals and built a life that mattered to them, regardless of London's approval. Lydia Ashford Thornton, Duchess of Greymoor, had finally found what she'd been searching for those 6 years of standing alone. Not rescue, not redemption, but the freedom to bloom exactly where she was planted, valued for her authentic self rather than her practiced perfections. And that, she reflected, as she stood in her library surrounded by books and ideas, and the man she loved, was the truest happy ending of all. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this tale has traveled. May you all find the courage to stand alone until the right person whispers, "Join me." And may you always choose partnership over rescue, authenticity over performance, and love built on genuine respect rather than social obligation.